You're sitting at your kitchen table holding a retirement statement, and the figure printed on it reads $44,000. You read it a second time just to be sure. Then you glance at your phone and the top headline announces that the average American retirement account has just hit a record high of $167,000. Same country, same year, same economy. So you do the only thing that seems reasonable. You assume you've fallen behind. You assume there was some meeting held in your 20s that nobody bothered inviting you to. You fold the statement in half, tuck it into a drawer, and add it to the pile of paperwork you've quietly decided you're not brave enough to face. That man is Desmond Ruiz, 41 years old, an HVAC installer in Dayton, Ohio. He might be the most statistically ordinary man in the entire country. And here's the twist. He isn't behind at all. Both numbers you just read are completely true. Nobody lied to you. But the gap between them is quite possibly the most expensive piece of misinformation floating around in your financial life right now. My name is Nick, and today we're going hunting for the man hiding inside that gap because he's out there. He's real, he's breathing, he owns a genuinely impressive garage, and he has absolutely no clue he's been quietly wrecking your self-esteem. Once you meet him, every jaw-dropping statistic about the average American is going to look shocking for a completely different reason than you expected. Here's the sleight of hand, and once you spot it, you can never unsee it again. When someone throws around the phrase average American, they're almost always talking about the mean. Add up every value, divide by the number of people, print the result, and hand it to you as gospel. Except that number is often nonsense. Picture 9 guys each earning $50,000 a year sitting in a room with one guy pulling in $10 million annually. The average income in that room suddenly jumps to nearly $1.5 million. Congratulations! Everyone in the room is technically a millionaire, while 9 of them are still trying to figure out how to afford a new transmission. Now watch what happens the instant that 10th guy walks out. The average collapses by roughly $1.5 million, and not a single person's actual life has changed in any way whatsoever. The median works completely differently. The median is the person standing dead center in the line, half the room ahead of him, half behind, and he genuinely doesn't care what the guy at the front of the line is holding. Nobody writes viral headlines about the median. The median doesn't perform well in a thumbnail. The median is an actual human being. The mean is basically a rumor with a decimal point. So Desmond's $44,000 figure is the median retirement balance, pulled straight from Vanguard's data covering millions of real accounts. The $167,000 splashed across the headline is the mean. Same dataset, same day, wildly different story. That gap isn't some rounding error, it's a snapshot of exactly who owns what in this country. And before we go any further, I owe you a promise. There's one number coming later in this video that's worse than every other statistic combined. It's the one that keeps me up at night. I'm saving it for the end because you need everything else first for it to actually land properly. Just know it's coming. Let's start with a statistic that could end this entire conversation on its own. Every year, the Federal Reserve asks Americans a beautifully simple question. If a $400 emergency showed up tomorrow, could you cover it in cash? Not a credit card. Not a loan from your brother. Not the crumpled 20 sitting in a coat you haven't worn since March. Actual cash. Roughly 37% of people say no. And $400 isn't exactly a medical catastrophe. That's a set of brake pads, or a water heater making a noise you've generously decided to interpret as personality rather than a warning sign. Nearly 4 in 10 adults in the wealthiest country human history has ever produced cannot absorb that hit without borrowing. Worse still, this number hasn't improved. It was actually better back in 2021 when the government was literally mailing out checks than it is today, after 3 straight years of headlines bragging about a red-hot economy. So what actually happens when that $400 bill lands? It goes straight onto the credit card. And the card is where the real damage quietly compounds, because almost nobody ever does this math out loud. The average interest rate on cards that are actually carrying a balance now hovers around 22%. On a brand new general purpose card, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau clocked it north of 25%. And the minimum payment, that innocent little number tucked at the bottom of your statement, is usually about 2% of the balance. Put those two figures side by side and something genuinely ugly happens. On a $2,000 balance sitting at 22% interest, the minimum payment comes out to about $40. Roughly $36 of that is pure interest. Only $4 actually chips away at the real debt. You're paying $40 a month to barely move the needle. That's not a repayment plan. That's a subscription to your own past. And that's exactly how Americans ended up handing over $160 billion in credit card interest in a single year. Not principal, just interest. That's the convenience fee we all collectively pay for not having $400 lying around. Now let's talk cars, because if the credit card is the wound, the car loan is the weapon. The average monthly payment on a new car in America now sits around $770. Used cars average roughly $530. And nearly 19% of new car buyers, almost 1 in 5, are signing up for payments north of $1,000 a month, a full grand every single month just for the privilege of sitting in traffic in a slightly nicer chair. But it's that $770 figure I really want you to sit with, because I don't think most people have ever actually run the numbers. Invest $770 a month instead, at an 8% annual return over 40 years, and it compounds to roughly $2.4 million. Let that sink in. The average American car payment is essentially a $2.4 million decision, which tells you the average American isn't too poor to become a millionaire. The average American is financing a depreciating hunk of metal instead of buying into something that grows in value, stretched across 60, 72, sometimes even 84 months. 84 months. That's a loan term that used to be reserved exclusively for buying an actual house, and subprime auto loan delinquencies have now hit the highest level ever recorded. Look, most people genuinely need a car. It's how you get to the job that pays for the car. That's not really a lifestyle choice. That's a toll booth with a steering wheel attached. Now here's where this stops being purely about spending habits. Roughly 29% of people using buy now, pay later services have used them to finance groceries. Groceries. Nearly half of all users have made a late payment within the past year, and more than half admit outright that they couldn't make ends meet without these services. Which brings us to Renata. She's 29, a dental hygienist earning about $58,000 a year, and she splits her grocery bill into 4 installments. Not because she's careless with money, but because payday lands on Friday and her kid needs to eat on Tuesday, and Tuesday has never once been willing to negotiate. Every single Sunday night, Renata does something I think about constantly. She opens her banking app, then her credit card app, then her buy now, pay later app, and finally the app for the second buy now, pay later service she signed up for, once the first one hit its limit. Then she does mental math across 4 different screens just to figure out which day of the week she's allowed to buy chicken. She's never called this budgeting, but honestly, the word would embarrass her. She calls it checking. Renata isn't some cautionary tale. Renata is a solvency bridge built out of a smartphone, and there are millions of people just like her, which is exactly the thing I want you carrying with you for the rest of this video. Every statistic coming up sounds on the surface like a story about personal failure. It isn't. It's a story about arithmetic that quietly stopped working and an entire industry that showed up very conveniently to sell people financing for the gap. Total American household debt just crossed $18.8 trillion. And the shape of that number matters far more than its size, because it isn't a mountain of yachts. It's roughly $13 trillion tied up in homes people simply needed somewhere to live. Another $1.5 trillion in cars people needed to get to work. Another $1.5 trillion in college degrees people were told were mandatory. And just over $1 trillion sitting on credit cards that mostly covered groceries, brake pads, and water heaters. That's not a spending spree. That's an entire country quietly putting its own survival on layaway. And the student loan piece of this just fell off a cliff in silence. Once the pandemic-era pause on reporting delinquencies expired, the share of balances 90-plus days past due jumped from under 1% to over 10%. That's not a gentle decline. That's a trap door swinging open. All right, that covers the debt side. Now, let's look at what's supposed to be sitting on the other side of the ledger. Back to Desmond and his $44,000, because there's a second half to that story, and it's worse. The standard rule of thumb says you can safely withdraw about 4% of your retirement savings each year without running out. 4% of $44,115 comes out to $1,765 a year, which breaks down to $147 a month. The median American's retirement plan pays out $147 a month. And even if we're generous and only look at people already 65 and older, the median climbs to about $318 a month. Meanwhile, retirees themselves say you need well north of $800,000 to retire comfortably. So it isn't really that most Americans have a modest retirement. It's that most Americans don't have a retirement plan at all. They have Social Security plus a tip. I'm not saying that as a punchline. About 78% of retirees rely on Social Security, and among those who earned under $50,000 a year, that figure climbs closer to 85%. 1 in 5 adults over 50 has nothing saved for retirement whatsoever. 0. Which brings us to the single most load-bearing number in the entire system, the one nobody wants to say out loud into a microphone. The latest trustees report projects the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund runs dry sometime around late 2032. After that point, payroll taxes alone would cover only about 77% of promised benefits, which is a very polite, very actuarial way of describing an automatic 23% haircut applied to the exact income source that 4 out of 5 retirees are currently standing on. Congress can fix this. Congress has fixed things like this before. But you probably want to know the beam is already cracked before someone assures you the whole house is fine. And you can watch people improvising around this in real time. 6% of workers took a hardship withdrawal from their 401k last year, up from just 2% 4 years earlier and climbing every single year since. Workers earning under $100,000 were 3.5 times more likely to do it. Sit with that for a second. The retirement account has effectively become the emergency fund because the actual emergency fund never existed to begin with. We're eating the seed corn in a country that won't stop bragging about the record harvest. Now let's talk about what all of this actually feels like, because a statistic is really just a feeling that somebody dropped into a spreadsheet. It feels like standing in the cereal aisle running math you already ran out in the car. It feels like that full body drop the instant the check engine light flicks on, followed by 2 seconds where you seriously consider whether you can pretend you didn't see it. It feels like telling your kid in a light, casual voice that the field trip probably isn't going to happen this time, and then being furious with yourself for how good you've gotten at that particular voice. It feels like lying awake at 2 in the morning, running numbers you've already run 40 times, as if attempt number 41 might somehow come out differently. And more than anything, it feels like being the only person going through it. That's exactly what these statistics get wrong simply by existing. Because 37% isn't a number when you're the one standing in the cereal aisle. When you're standing in that aisle, 37% is just you. Okay, housing, quickly, because you already know. The median home price sits around $427,000, while median household income sits around $83,700. A price-to-income ratio of roughly 5 to 1. Back in 1990, that ratio was 3.2 to 1. In 1970, it was 2.2 to 1. And the house itself didn't magically become 3 times better. Same beige carpet. Nobody added a wing. Half of all renters in America, a record 22.6 million households, now spend over 30% of their income on rent, and 12 million of those households spend more than half. Some realtor associations report the median first-time homebuyer is now 40 years old. Though that particular number is contested, mortgage records put it closer to 33, and I'd rather tell you that honestly than pretend I never saw it. But nobody disputes the direction it's moving. Back in the 80s, that median age was 29. Either way, we've bolted the better part of a decade onto the runway. Now you're probably thinking, okay, Nick, this all sounds pretty grim, but maybe things are actually improving and you're just cherry-picking the worst numbers you could find. Good. You should absolutely think that. And here's the thing, you're partly right. So let me hand you the strongest possible version of your own argument. 401k participation just hit a record high of 86%. 2 decades ago, it sat at 65%. Poverty dropped to about 11.5%, close to the lowest level ever recorded, down from 22% back in 1959. And between 2019 and 2023, real wages for the lowest paid 10% of American workers actually grew faster than for anyone above them, clawing back a real chunk of 40 years of widening inequality. Those numbers are all genuinely true. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But look very closely at that first one because it's really the whole ballgame. Why exactly did 401k participation jump all the way to 86%? Did the entire country suddenly discover financial discipline overnight? Did everyone read the same self-help book? No, 61% of retirement plans now enroll employees automatically. And in plans that enroll people automatically, participation runs around 94%. In plans where you have to actively opt in yourself, it's closer to 64%. Same humans, same wages, same amount of willpower, a 30-point swing. The single most successful piece of retirement policy in modern American history worked by flipping a checkbox, not by changing a single person's character. Nobody suddenly got smarter. Somebody just quietly changed the default setting. Which proves the exact thing I most want you to walk away with today. This fragility isn't human nature, it's a setting, and somebody made a choice about where to set it. And it cuts both ways too. The average American spends about $219 a month on subscriptions, while genuinely believing they're only spending $86. That's not a personal character flaw. That's a business model built entirely on the mathematical certainty that you'll never actually check. Americans spent $14.7 billion on lottery tickets in a single year, in a country where 37% can't scrape together $400 for an emergency. And the House doesn't just win, the House funds the school system with money pulled from people who can't afford brake pads, and then that same school system never gets around to teaching financial literacy. So let me finally introduce you to the man hiding in the gap. His name is Gerald, he's 63, an orthodontist just outside Scottsdale, and he's sitting on $2.1 million across his retirement accounts. He got there by earning a solid income for 30 straight years and doing absolutely nothing clever with it, which honestly is how it usually works. Gerald isn't the villain of this story. He's never met Desmond and never will. He's a perfectly decent man who happens to be very good at teeth. But Gerald is exactly why that headline said $167,000. Gerald, along with a few million people just like him, is what quietly transforms Desmond's $44,000 into a number that makes Desmond feel like a failure. Gerald isn't hiding anything at all. He was simply averaged in, quietly, while Desmond was quietly measured against the result. And that's the real con, even though nobody actually committed any fraud. The system just built a measuring stick out of everybody combined, handed it to the guy standing dead center, and let him quietly conclude he'd come up short. If you're sitting there right now feeling that very specific, very quiet shame, the kind that makes a person fold up a piece of paper and hide it in a drawer, listen closely. You were told to measure yourself against an average deliberately engineered to include the top 10%, a group that holds roughly 67% of all the wealth in this entire country. You were told retirement was purely your personal responsibility, then handed a system where 6% of your coworkers are already rating it just to keep the lights on. You were told to simply budget better by an industry that pulls in $160 billion a year specifically because you can't. You are not behind. You were handed a measuring stick that was crooked by design. This is exactly the kind of thing we dig into inside our community, where I break down the real numbers instead of the headline versions of them. Links are down in the description if you want to join us. Now, I promised you one number worse than everything else in this video. Here it is. The median American household's net worth sits around $192,900. The mean sits at $1,163,700. There's Gerald again, dragging the average up more than 5.5 times over. But now take the house out of the equation. Strip out home equity entirely, because you can't eat your own kitchen. And the median American household's net worth collapses down to somewhere around $57,900. That's it. That's the entire cushion. Everything sitting outside the walls you sleep inside and still owe the bank for. The middle of this country is sitting on roughly $58,000 total, and that single number somehow has to cover retirement, emergencies, a layoff, a rough diagnosis, and 30 full years of simply being old. That's the number. That's the one that genuinely keeps me up at night. So what do you actually do with all of this? Start by ditching the mean entirely. That one's free. Every single time you hear the word average attached to money, ask yourself average of whom, and notice how often the honest answer turns out to be some guy in Scottsdale you're never going to meet. You're not competing against him. You never were. Next, change exactly one default setting instead of trying to make 20 heroic decisions in a row, because that's literally what the 86% statistic just taught us. Nobody actually needs that particular car. And the difference between those two choices, compounded across an entire working life, adds up to a 7-figure number that no act of Congress and no trust fund will ever get to touch. I want to leave you back at that kitchen table. Desmond eventually took the statement back out of the drawer. He didn't fix his entire life in one move. Nobody ever really does. He just logged into the portal, bumped his contribution from 4% up to 5%, which cost him about $32.19 per paycheck, and set that increase to repeat automatically every single January, so he'd never have to work up the courage to do it twice. Renata is still splitting her groceries into 4 payments, because $58,000 is still $58,000, and no YouTube video has ever once moved a payday. But last Sunday, she only opened 3 apps instead of 4, because for the very first time in her life, she actually called the credit card company and asked out loud what her real interest rate was, 26.9%. Nobody had ever told her before. She'd never even thought to ask because she'd always assumed that number was some kind of verdict on her character rather than simply the price tag on a financial product. And Gerald is doing just fine. Gerald was always going to be fine. Right now, somewhere out there, he's quietly being averaged into a headline, completely unaware that a man in Dayton spent 8 years thinking he was a failure partly because of him. That's the real shocking statistic here. It isn't that the average American is broke. The average American doesn't actually exist. It's that the real person, the one standing dead center in the line, has spent his entire working life comparing himself to a ghost and quietly concluding that he was the one who came up short. You didn't come up short. You were simply handed the wrong number. Go get the right one.